Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video of mine in which I talk about books. And I'm going through shelves that have been a bit neglected because they've been behind piles of other stuff. So if I cough with dust, that's why. Socks is here on my lap. Can you see him? He's still dozing crossly on my lap. I might lift up the thing a bit. Very technical. Right, here's something I've only dipped into. It's Holmes for the holidays. Whoops, Christmas cards are falling out of it. Edited by Martin H. Greenberg. Now there's a name to conjure with. his books, published by, this is Barclay Prime Crime, but I think, see, Dusty. I've read some wonderful anthologies by him. This fella must have, I hope he's still around, must have spent his whole time thinking up fantastic ideas for anthologies. And I've got collections of stories about the Joker from Batman, written by people like Isaac Asimov and incredible people. Or he would pick a theme like dinosaurs in space, or cyberpunk, or steampunk, and they'd be very specific, killer teddy bears, and he'd get all of these amazing people to write new stories. Now this is the combination of Sherlock Holmes and Christmas, which is completely irresistible, isn't it? And often they were science fiction people and mystery people all mixed up, because generally those people are fans of each other's genres and like to kind of moonlight. Anne Perry, this begins with. I can't remember any in particular as standing out just yet, but with titles like The Adventure of the Angel's Trumpet and The Sleuth of Christmas Past and The Adventure of the Canine Ventriloquist. It's, yeah, the Yuletide affair. And what's lovely about it as well is it's a lovely old library hardback. I know people like fancy and new books. I love a battered library hardback. You never really see, maybe they sold them all and they've all gone now, library sales in Manchester. Other places I've lived, you would go to these things and go and buy, score these amazing books for next to nothing. You never see that now. This is my copy of a Roald Dahl book, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, the first sequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And this is 73, Faith Jacks doing the illustrations before it was all turned over to Quentin Blake. I love Quentin Blake's drawings, obviously, and always have, but it's a shame that he is the only person that's allowed to do Roald Dahl these days. There's something about these kind of slightly cross-hatchy, old-fashioned looking pictures that suits him, I think. He wasn't just, I hate the word, but Zeni, which is the kind of the way he's published now. He wasn't just that. There's something maudlin and crepuscular, if that's the right word, about his atmosphere. This is a kind of out and out science fiction adventure with the elevator being shot into space. I think this is the one with kind of very dodgy racial stereotypes in. I think so. I think it's kind of one of the ones that have fallen out of favor, perhaps. One of the ones that they've tried to tidy up. There was some chat last year, some kind of fake outrage in the media about Roald Dahl being tidied up and rewritten for a different audience, for a more kind of right-on contemporary audience. I had very mixed feelings about the whole thing. Depends who does it. People don't realize how much books are altered all the time. And I wrote a parodic piece about it, actually, that I must dig out. One of my more sarcastic short stories. Um, the thing that I loved most when I was a kid by him was Danny the Champion of the World, which I read again and again, and I think was such a warm and sweet story. And because it's about fathers and sons as well, something I was so alien to me, having that kind of um, loving, caring relationship with a father. I suppose that's something I was uh, missing in life, and the book kind of, because it was about that in such glowing terms, it appealed to me. But I read that book again and again. Anyway, I'll always go back to Roald Dahl. I found this. I've gone on about my. Oh, they're not in here. They're through there. The other two volumes of this. They're Christmas anthologies published by Scholastic. So they're related to Point Horror in the States, and the British Point Horror uh, authors were all um, brought in to write Christmassy stories. And they are incredible people. They are, it's Joan Aiken, it's K.M. Payton, it's Susan Price, Gillian Cross, Gary Kilworth. These are classic voices of the, I guess, 80s and 90s. And what were the other two? The titles are so. Oh, there was Haunting Christmas Tales, and this is Chilling Christmas Tales. I think this might be the last one, but they were all designed in a similar way. It was so atmospheric, and I still love to sit down with these every Christmas. Robert Swindles. Now, this is the one where the family get lost on their way home on Christmas Eve and find a spooky house that they have to stay in, and it's really quite quite frightening. He wrote in all sorts of genres for kids, and I loved his books, and I forgot about them completely. It's amazing. Some people just disappear from your reading memory, and I think that's to do with how much you read as a kid, and going to the library and bringing things back and then taking them back before you kept proper lists. And sometimes these names float back into your ken, and it's such a relief. And I did go looking for other things by him that I might have read back then. Another couple of collections of spooky things for kids. We were so lucky, the generation who was reading kids' books in the 70s and 80s. This is from 1980. The Skylark, Ghost and Monster Stories book, edited by Jill Bennett. This begins with a Richard Davis story. He edited books himself, usually science fiction ones. The Nondescript. This is a horrifying story. I think it's in a couple of anthologies, this one. It's about it was like a mermaid, or rather a merman, but not the romantic storybook kind. It was about 4 feet long, with its scaly fishtail curved gracefully under it. From the waist up, it was, as Mum said, horrid, a skinny, leathery body, with thin but strong-looking arms ending in clawed, graspy hands. Worst of all was the head, a bit like a monkey's, but uglier than any monkey you ever saw. Pale, glaring eyes, scanty black hair, and a wide, snarling mouth filled with pointed fangs. "Isn't it smashing?" laughed Bob. "Straight out of Doctor Who." "If they had him on the telly, people would ring up complaining," said Dad, "and I wouldn't blame them. He's a splendid piece of work, though. What do you reckon he's made from?" "You mean it's not real?" cried Carol. "Thank goodness." "Of course not," said Bob. "There's no such things as mermaids. The bottom half must be a fish, but the top, I don't know, it looks awfully like a man, a very ugly little man." "I should think," said Dad, "it's a monkey, doctored up a bit. Those glass eyes, for example." "Well, we've made quite a find. What shall we do with him?" "I want him in my room," said Bob. "You're not putting that hideous thing on show," said Mum. There is a nondescript. Is it a nondescript or non-such? I've heard them called nonsuchers as well, in the Horniman Museum in London. And it is pretty horrifying. This kind of, I think, Edwardian or Victorian mock-up of a mermaid about this big, a kind of stitched together remnants of other creatures to look like something uh, supernatural. The Methuen book of sinister stories with Tony Ross illustrations. It's a lovely book. Again, a library one, withdrawn from stock in February 1983. With the usual bunch of people. That's not fair. The It's not the usual because they're different every time, but you see the same names coming around. And here's Robert Swindles again, and Jan Mark, Vivian Alcock, Joan Aiken, Anne Pilling. Again, names that I've kind of forgotten about. And it's nice to see Tony Ross doing some spooky pictures as well, because he's got a kind of fine, macabre sensibility at times. It's not just comic, his cartoons. There's no reason why cartoons should just be comic, of course. Right. I'm looking forward to doing, I hope I'm still doing these YouTube videos in October and building up to Halloween. It's a good excuse to dig out all these anthologies again and maybe read some stuff out and organise Halloween reading. Right, also off this shelf, Debbie Harry's memoir Face It, which is such a heavy book because of the number of photos in it. I was shocked by the raciness of the life, to be honest. I couldn't believe all the drugs, really. What's unusual is that she writes really well, and I hope it's her. I hope it's not a ghostwriter. It was a beautifully designed book as well. It just felt like somebody cared, and most pop things, people don't really care. They just chucked it out as merchandise. But in recent years, there's been a spate of rock and pop biographies by people who were there at the thick of things during all those kind of classic years, and she's one of them, and she produces a really good uh, account of it all. More ex-library kids books. Eric Houghton's Gates of Glass, which is a kind of secondary fantasy world story that's from Derbyshire County Library, withdrawn 1987. I don't remember so much about this. It's all right. It's not. It's not Steps Back in Time, which is his book from 1980, which Miss Booth read us in fourth year juniors. The one about the little boy who goes home uh, to his single parent, his father, and he's bullied at school. Lives in this northern town, and when the fog comes down, when he goes home, it's to a different time, and it's the future, where everything seems a bit nicer. And it's the most melancholic time travel book I've read. This is kind of out and out fantasy. Uh, this is how Julia enters a world of glass. It's an enchanting world with glittering stalactites and rainbowed cliffs, but it's also dangerous and bewildering with its maze-like tunnels, black swirling rivers, and pools of molten glass. It has a touch, as I remember, of what am I thinking of? The one with Mrs. Who. It's gone. That's ridiculous. Madeline Engel. It will come back. Anyway, yeah, it has a touch of that, of being somehow allegorical and teaching you something about the world. Wrinkle in Time. That's what I'm thinking of. Okay, what else? Nina Beechcroft. Well met by Witchlight. She's a great writer. People don't talk about her. I went and found everything and bought everything again. This is her first. They're always witchy or folk horror-ish, as we call it now. Um, Three children out walking in the woods one day are surprised to see a strange-looking person climbing swiftly down through the branches of a beech tree. A little old woman in a shabby raincoat and a rosy, innocent face. It's soon apparent to the children that this new friend of theirs is nothing less than a witch. Mary has lived as a recluse for years and fears her powers are weakened, but the children's belief in her soon encourages her to try out her old magic. For them, of course, it is wildly exciting when Lucy's tooth is planted in the ground and grows into a pearl, when Sarah goes for a broomstick ride and Christopher finds he has the strength of 10. I love stories about witches. Just recently I picked up, um, very cheap, no one seemed to want them, the whole series of Simon and the Witch from the 80s. But I'm thinking as well of things like Helen Cresswell's Lizzie Dripping, where the witches were friendly, kind of pagan versions of, or immoral versions of Mary Poppins. They always, I suppose, they're interesting because it's about bad behavior and about learning to have adult role models who aren't well behaved, who can show other ways of doing things. That's the point about witchy characters in stories like that. It's an alternative way of growing up. And I suppose there's, as a kind of queer kid, that's what you're looking for as well. How do you grow up not to be your parents, not to be in the kind of ordinary world? And magical figures outside of that are therefore important as glamorous role models. Glamour in obviously in the sense of glamorous, but also uh, casting a spell glamour too. So Nina Beechcroft, I would recommend. I haven't read them all yet, and they're dotted around the house, but she writes so nicely. I'm always searching for this one particular book from about this time, and I thought it might have been one of hers, and it's not. And I thought it might have been this, the Eric Houghton book, but it wasn't. And it's a book that begins. It was a slim science fiction fantasy novel, and it began by a river with a girl talking to a kind of harlequin figure, this very spooky, uh, ambiguous, magical figure who was like a harlequin. And that's just about all I remember of the book. No author, no title, none of what happens. Just this compelling, weird atmosphere at the start of the story. And I read this in about 1980 as a hardback from the library, and I'm always looking for it. And maybe it's best if I don't find it. It's one of those things where the search for it is better than ever finding it. This is an anthology, Cricket's Choice. It's an American kind of anthology thing from the mid 70s. And if I remember right, I mean, it's got wonderful people in, like Spike Milligan and uh, Arnold Lobel, who did Toad. Is it Frog and Toad and Frog? Which way around? It's him. Frog was in his garden. Toad came walking by. What a fine garden you have, Frog. Yes, said Frog, it's very nice, but it was hard work. I wish I had a garden, said Toad. Here are some flower seeds. Plant them in the garden, said Frog, and soon you'll have a garden. How, how soon? Asked Toad. Quite soon, said Frog. Toad ran home. He planted the flower seeds. Now, seeds, said Toad, start growing. Toad walked up and down a few times. The seeds did not start to grow. Toad put his head close to the ground and said loudly, now, seeds, start growing. Toad looked around again. The seeds did not start to grow. Toad put his head very close to the ground and started shouting, now, seeds, start growing. Frog came running up the path. What is all this noise? He asked. My seeds will not grow, said Toad. You're shouting too much, said Frog. These poor seeds are afraid to grow. My seeds are afraid to grow? Asked Toad. Of course, said Frog. Leave them alone for a few days. Let the sun shine on them. Let the rain fall on them, and soon your seeds will start to grow. That night, Toad looked out of his window. Drat, said Toad, my seeds have not started to grow. They must be afraid of the dark. Toad went out to his garden with some candles. I will read the seeds a story, said Toad. Then they won't be afraid. Toad read a long story to his seeds. All the next day, Toad sang songs to his weeds. All the next day, Toad read poems to his seeds. And all the next day, Toad played music for his seeds. Toad looked at the ground. The seeds still did not start to grow. What shall I do? Cried Toad. These must be the most frightened seeds in the whole world. And then Toad fell asleep. Toad, Toad, wake up, said Frog. Look at your garden. Toad looked at his garden. Little green plants were coming out of the ground. At last, shouted Toad, my seeds have stopped being afraid to grow. And now you will have a nice garden too, said Frog. Yes, said Toad, but you were right, Frog. It was very hard work. I love the drawings in these. Somewhere I've got all of the Frog and Toad books. We went to a book sale in, there they are, in Gorton, the Gorton Monastery in Manchester, which is just this amazing old building. We've been to a number of things there, but they did a book sale a year or so ago. Loads of antiquarian booksellers, and they were all quite glum because people weren't coming to buy their stuff. It was really noticeable that post-COVID, people weren't trooping out to buy these maps and postcards and photos and hardbacks and paperbacks and comics and magazines. They were all laid out there beautifully. Every stall had set everything out so nicely, and they had to reduce their prices. And I bought loads that day, and we sat in the cafe having cake and tea in the kind of courtyard bit of this monastery. And I sat reading Frog and Toad. It was a nice day out. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. Look, it's 22 minutes of your time already. I hope you're still watching all of these, and I hope, yeah, I'm not being too self-indulgently boring reading out bits I like. Anyway, I'll see you again soon in the next adventure. I mean episode, don't I? Not adventure.